The radar screen at Edwards Air Force Base Control didn't lie. Something was wrong with Flight 801. The controller on duty that Friday morning was a 20-year veteran named Stu Harwick, a man who had talked down everything from engine failures to bird strikes without ever raising his voice above a conversational tone. He had a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Dad" and a framed photo of his golden retriever on the desk beside his monitor. He was not a man who frightened easily. But when the distress signal blinked to life on his screen and the radio crackled open, something in his chest went cold. Edwards Center, this is Pacific Airways Flight 801. Declaring emergency. Repeat. Declaring emergency. Both flight deck crew are incapacitated. I am manually flying the aircraft. Requesting immediate emergency vector and runway clearance. Stu leaned there forward. Flight 801, say again. Who is on the mic? A pause, just long enough for him to wonder if he'd imagined it. This is Sarah Caldwell. I'm a passenger. I have FAA commercial certification and military flight hours. I need a runway. Now. The room went quiet. Every controller on duty turned from their screens. Stu Harwick set down his coffee mug very carefully the way a man does when he wants his hands free. Copy that, Flight 801. You have Edwards, runway 22. Left is yours. What is your current altitude and souls on board? 31,000 feet, descending, 320 souls. Another pause. And Caldwell. Her voice didn't waver, not even slightly. You're going to want fire and rescue standing by. This landing is going to be heavy. Then she was gone back to whatever she was fighting up there at the edge of the sky, and Stu Harwick was already reaching for the emergency line, already thinking about ambulances and hazmat units, and the kind of paperwork that only gets filed when something enormous either goes very right or very wrong. He didn't know yet which one it would be. None of them did. 90 minutes earlier, the world had looked entirely different. Honolulu International Airport on a Friday morning in October had its own particular rhythm, the kind that only airports achieve a tempo built entirely out of other people's urgency. Families hauling too many bags. Business people staring at phones like the answers to their lives were somewhere inside the glass. Children running ahead of parents who had already surrendered to the chaos. Sarah Caldwell moved through all of it like water through rock. Unhurried, unremarkable. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and sunglasses large enough to qualify as a personal policy. Her shirt was linen pale blue, half tucked into jeans, worn soft from actual use. Her bag was canvas, the kind that looked like it had been across a few continents and hadn't minded. She carried a paperback novel, a water bottle, and exactly nothing that would make anyone look twice. That was the point. She had learned over a long career that the most useful skill a person could possess had nothing to do with marksmanship or flight hours or tactical decision-making under fire. It was this, the ability to be completely present in a room while appearing to be completely elsewhere, to see everything while being seen as nothing. She had been doing it for so long it had stopped feeling like a skill. It felt like breathing. Her boarding pass read Sarah Caldwell. Her seat assignment was 23B, an aisle seat. Not the window, which might suggest a tourist wanting views. Not the middle, which served no purpose she could calculate. The aisle because the aisle gave her options. And Sarah Caldwell had spent enough years in environments where options were the difference between walking out and not walking out at all. She joined the queue for Pacific Airways Flight 801 to Los Angeles, positioned herself near the middle of the line and waited. While she waited, she cataloged. The gate agent, a young woman moving with the practiced efficiency of someone 6 hours into a 9-hour shift. The TSA officer near the jetway door, relaxed posture, scanning faces without intensity. A man 3 rows over in the waiting area tapping his knee with 2 fingers. Not nervous, she decided just a drummer's habit. A mother with an infant asleep in a carrier against her chest. The mother's eyes already glazing with the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in months. None of it was cause for alarm. Sarah didn't do cause for alarm. She did preparation. She did observation. She did readiness without performance, the quiet maintenance of a state of mind that most people only touch for seconds at a time, usually when something had already gone wrong. She had lived there for years. She was on vacation. The thought almost made her smile. Hawaii had been her sister's idea, delivered with the specific forcefulness that only older siblings can achieve. You need to go somewhere, Carol had said on the phone, her voice carrying all the weight of 5 years of watching her sister hollow out from the inside. Somewhere that doesn't know your name. Somewhere with water and sun and absolutely nothing that requires any version of you to be in charge of anything. So Sarah had flown to Honolulu. She had sat on a beach for 4 days. She had read 3 novels, 2 of them bad enough to be genuinely restful. She had watched the sun go down over the Pacific twice without thinking once about angles of approach or weather windows or the mathematics of survival. On the third sunset, she had cried briefly and privately for reasons she didn't examine too closely. On the fourth day, she had booked her flight home. She was ready. She was not in any conventional sense at peace, but she was something. She was functional. She was moving. After 5 years of standing still in ways that had nothing to do with her feet, she was willing to count that. The boarding call came. Sarah Rose joined the stream and stepped forward into the jetway. She gave a single nod to the flight attendant. At the door, a young woman with a practiced smile and a name badge that read Leah Merritt. Leah smiled back with genuine warmth. Sarah moved past her down the aisle, past rows of settling passengers, and found her seat. 23B. She sat. She tucked her bag under the seat in front of her and opened her novel to a page she had not actually been reading. Around her, the business of boarding continued. Overhead bins slamming. A child 3 rows back already asking when they would arrive. 2 men in the row across from her negotiating politely over the armrest in the way that American strangers do, formal and apologetic and completely determined to win. Sarah watched the flight crew. She always watched the flight crew. The senior flight attendant working the forward galley was a man in his mid-30s with a calm face and the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he had done this long enough to stop finding it interesting. His name badge said Ryan Beckett. He moved with economy, no wasted gesture, the posture of someone who had learned to inhabit a confined space with grace. She noted the way he checked the overhead compartments without being asked. She noted the way his eyes swept the cabin at intervals, not anxious, just professional. He reminded her of pilots she had respected. That was the highest compliment she knew how to give. A man in a suit settled into the seat beside her, 23A the window. He was mid-50s, tired already, opening a laptop before the plane had even pushed back. He gave her a brief, courteous nod. She returned it. Nothing more was required or expected. Somewhere in the forward section, the cockpit door was open for a few minutes while the ground crew completed their handoff. Through the gap, Sarah caught a glimpse of the flight deck. 2 figures. The captain, older gray at the temples, moving with the relaxed authority of someone who had made this route enough times to fly it in his sleep. And the first officer. She saw him for only a moment. Young, mid-20s at most. Dark hair, straight posture, the particular alertness of someone still new enough to the job to be paying full attention to everything. He glanced back through the open door for just a second, surveying the cabin the way junior officers do when they're still learning to see the whole picture, and then the cockpit door closed and he was gone. Sarah looked back at her novel. She did not know why she kept thinking about him. She told herself it was nothing. Professional habit. The way doctors clock other people's symptoms without meaning to. The way architects see structural flaws in buildings while having dinner inside them. You spent enough time in a cockpit and you started reading flight crews the way civilians read faces. It was automatic. It meant nothing. She turned a page she hadn't read and let the boarding noise wash over her. That was when her hand found the photograph. She hadn't planned to look at it. She had tucked it into the front pocket of her bag 3 days ago without much thought, the way you put something in a place where you know it is, but don't have to look at it directly. An arm's length arrangement, a manageable distance, but her fingers found the edge of it anyway and she drew it out. It was old. The colors had that particular warmth of a photograph that had been handled too many times. The corners softened the surface, slightly clouded by years and fingerprints and the accumulated weight of being carried everywhere. She held it between both hands and looked at it. 2 people in flight suits, both young, both laughing. Behind them, a gray expanse of tarmac and the unmistakable silhouette of an F-15, its twin engines like 2 fists braced against the sky. She was on the left. He was on the right. She had not looked young in that photograph, even when it was taken, not in the way civilians mean young, soft and uncertain. But there was something in her face that was gone now, a particular quality of openness. The expression of someone who had been through enough to know that things could go wrong, but not yet through the thing that would make her stop expecting them to go right. He was grinning. He was always grinning. It was the most reliable thing about him. The kind of grin that made the people around him feel like whatever came next was probably going to be all right, because how bad could it get when someone standing next to you was smiling like that? She turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was his. She knew every loop and angle of it, from years of shared logbooks and briefing notes and the occasional message left on her instrument panel when he wanted to make a point without starting an argument. We made it out. For now, D. He had written it as a joke. That was what she needed to remember. He had written it as a joke because they were 20 minutes off base after a run that had come closer than either of them was willing to say out loud, and he had borrowed a pen from the ground crew photographer and scrawled it on the back of the print because that was who he was. The man who turned the close calls into punchlines because the alternative was sitting with them, and he had never been able to sit still. She had laughed when she read it. She had kept laughing for 2 more years. And then Syria, 2019. And the laughter stopped, and everything else stopped with it, and nothing she had done in the 5 years since had quite managed to restart it. She put the photograph back in her bag. The plane began to push back from the gate. Sarah closed her novel and looked out across the cabin, past the man with the laptop, through the small oval of the window at the heat shimmering off the tarmac outside. Honolulu was bright and flat under the October sun. The kind of morning that made the world look like a postcard. Safe, lit, uncomplicated. She let herself believe that for exactly as long as it took the wheels to leave the ground. Pacific Airways Flight 801 climbed smoothly out of Honolulu, banking south before curving northeast toward the mainland. The Pacific opened beneath it, enormous and dark blue and indifferent to the small silver machine cutting through the air above it. Inside the cabin, the rituals of commercial flight began. Laptops opened, headphones went on. The beverage cart emerged from the forward galley and began its slow progression down the aisle. Sarah declined everything. She kept her novel open on her lap and her hands still on the armrests, and her attention spread evenly across the cabin the way you keep a fire low. Not consuming, just present, always present. She noted Leah Merritt pausing at a row near the back, bending slightly to speak with an elderly couple, her posture easy and warm. She noted Ryan Beckett moving through the mid-cabin, working efficiently, making small conversation with the ease of someone who had decided it was part of the mom and had chosen to do it well. She noted the shift in engine tone as the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the autopilot settled in that slight settling of a machine into its rhythm, the way a long-distance runner finds their pace. 36,000 feet, smooth air, clear skies all the way to the coast. It should have been quiet, and it was quiet. For a while, Sarah was 40 minutes into a chapter she had not retained a single sentence of when she felt it. Not heard. Felt. A vibration in the seat beneath her that had no business being there. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. A subtle, almost subliminal tremor. The kind that might belong to a patch of light turbulence, except that the air outside was perfectly still, and there had been no weather advisory, and the surface of her water bottle was not disturbed in the slightest. She sat up straighter. The vibration was gone. The engine sounded normal. The cabin continued its unremarkable hum. 2 rows ahead, a child was laughing at something on a tablet screen, and the man with the laptop was typing, and nobody else had moved. But Sarah's hands had come off the armrests and into her lap, and her shoulders had shifted back almost imperceptibly, and her eyes had stopped moving in their easy sweep and fixed on nothing the way the eyes fix when the brain is working on something faster than the body can keep up with. She knew that vibration. She had felt it before, not on a commercial aircraft, but in training runs, and in actual operations in machines that were being asked to do something their systems hadn't planned for. It was the vibration of a compensating system. Not turbulence, not mechanical failure, something internal. A trim correction triggered by a manual input it hadn't been expecting. A system responding to something it needed to account for. Something was being corrected up front, during cruise, which did not happen on a clean flight. She waited. 5 minutes of sitting perfectly still, while her mind ran through every benign explanation it could construct, pilot adjusting course manually, a minor navigation, update, routine system check, and found each one slightly less convincing than the last. Leah Merritt passed her on the way to the forward galley. Sarah watched her go. The flight attendant's face was arranged in his professional register, but her walk had a quality Sarah recognized, the slightly elevated pace of someone who was not panicking but had moved 2 degrees closer to it than they wanted to be. 3 minutes later, Leah emerged from the galley and walked to the phone mounted at the forward bulkhead. She lifted the handset, waited, set it down, lifted it again, set it down again. The cockpit was not answering. Sarah uncrossed her legs. She looked around the cabin. The other passengers were largely insulated in their own private worlds, headphones and screens and sleepy. Beautiful obliviousness of people who had bought their ticket and released control of everything. None of them had noticed. People on commercial flights almost never noticed because the entire architecture of modern aviation was designed to make them not notice. Sarah noticed. She noticed Ryan Beckett now standing at the forward galley entrance, speaking quietly with Leah Merritt. his body angled in the way that people angle when they're trying to have a serious conversation without appearing to have one. She noticed the very small tension in the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man holding himself together, because there are 319 people in the room, and not a single one of them can be allowed to see him not holding together. She reached under the seat in front of her and opened her bag. Her hand found the black nylon folder inside slim and flat, the kind of thing that sat quietly at the bottom of every bag she owned because she had not once in 17 years left home without it. She pulled it out. She opened it. Inside, a laminated FAA commercial pilot certificate, an instrument rating, a type rating for Boeing 737 and 747 platforms. And behind those still current, by 4 months in Airbus, and 320 certifications she had maintained out of a habit she couldn't quite bring herself to break. Beside those, a federal identification card. She looked at it for a moment, at the photograph on it, at the name below the photograph. Then the intercom chimed. It was a different sound from the standard chime, shorter, lower in frequency. And the voice that followed it was Leah Merritt's carefully composed the voice of someone who had been trained for exactly this moment and was discovering that training and experience are not the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your cabin crew. We apologize for the interruption to your flight. If there is a licensed pilot aboard any licensed pilot, we ask that you please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. The cabin changed. It changed the way a room changes when someone opens a window in winter. You didn't see it happen. You felt it. The background noise of 300 lives in progress stumbled. Interrupted, and in the gap left by that interruption, something colder moved in. Heads came up from screens. Earphones came out. The child who had been laughing was not laughing anymore. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Sarah Caldwell stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't announce herself. She simply rose from 23B with the quiet finality of someone who had calculated everything and was done calculating. She picked up the black nylon folder. She stepped into the aisle. Ryan Beckett was already coming toward her from the forward section. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked at the folder. She opened it. He looked at the credentials for exactly as long as it took to understand what he was seeing. "You're actually a pilot," he said. "I'm your best option right now," she said. "Take me to the cockpit." He didn't argue. He turned. She followed. The cockpit door was unlocked. Emergency protocol had already disengaged the security mechanism, and the door swung inward as soon as Ryan Beckett pressed the release. He stood aside. She stepped through. What she saw stopped her for half a second. Just half a second. The captain was in the left seat, conscious, but barely. His skin had gone the color of old brick. The particular flushed redness associated not with altitude sickness, but with hypoxia, the body's vessels dilating in protest as the brain started losing the argument with insufficient oxygen. His hands were on the controls, but his grip was wrong, too loose, and slightly trembling, the grip of a man who had told himself he was still flying when he was no longer flying. The first officer was in the right seat, and he was not conscious at all. He was young, dark hair, the particular stillness of someone for whom the body had simply stopped rather than slowed. His hands were in his lap. He was the man she had seen through the cockpit door at the gate. Sarah went straight to the environmental controls. She killed the ventilation draw to the cockpit, cutting off whatever was still feeding in from below. She found the emergency oxygen supply panel, pulled the captain's mask from its housing, and had it on his face before he could protest. He tried to speak. She told him to breathe. He breathed. Then she looked at the air quality monitoring panel. The display was blank. Not offline in the way of a system waiting to initialize. Blank in the way of something that had been told to stop looking and had complied. The indicator light that should have been cycling green, the one confirming the sensor in the avionics bay below them was doing its job, was dark. Had been dark, she understood, for the entire flight. She looked at it for 2 full seconds. Someone had turned it off. She didn't know when. She didn't know who. She filed that information in the place where she kept things that mattered, but could not be acted on yet, and she turned back to the captain. His eyes tried to focus on her. "You're the pilot," he managed. "I'm the pilot," she said. She looked at the navigation display. The aircraft had drifted 17 miles south of the planned course during the minutes no one had been fully in control. The autopilot had disconnected. Manual flight mode was active, which meant the aircraft was doing roughly what it was supposed to do by inertia and trim, but inertia and trim were not a flight plan, and they were not going to get 320 people safely on the ground. She looked at the fuel gauge. She looked at the altitude. She looked at the hydraulic indicators. System 2 was running low. Not critical yet, but declining. She slid into the left seat. The controls were in her hands before the thought of it had fully formed, and something happened in that moment that she had not expected and could not have prepared for. The sensation of the yoke under her palms, the living vibration of an aircraft in flight, transmitted through metal and wire and hydraulic fluid, the immediate intimacy of a machine, telling her everything about itself through the pressure of her hands on its controls. She had forgotten what this felt like. She had spent 5 years trying to forget, and she had almost succeeded. And now it came back not as a memory, but as a physical truth. The way your body remembers swimming, not in the mind, but in the muscles, in the nerves, in the place where training goes, when it has been done long enough to become permanent. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. She keyed the radio. Edwards Center, this is Pacific Airways Flight 801. Declaring emergency. Repeat. Declaring emergency. Both flight deck crew are incapacitated. I am manually flying the aircraft. Requesting immediate emergency vector and runway clearance. The response came within seconds. Flight 801, say again. Who is on the mic? Sarah looked at the Pacific spread below the clouds. She looked at the instruments. She looked at the long road home and calculated it the way she had calculated 1,000 roads in 1,000 skies over 10 years of flying. Things that were never supposed to be gentle. This is Sarah Caldwell, she said. I'm a passenger. I have FAA commercial certification and military flight hours. I need a runway. Now. A pause. The pause of a man doing math very quickly. Copy that, Flight 801. You have Edwards. Runway 22 left is yours. What is your current altitude and souls on board? 31,000 feet, descending, 320 souls. She reached for the intercom, the cabin switch. The button she had pressed 10,000 times in her career and had told herself she would never press again. Her thumb settled on it. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, this is Captain Sarah Caldwell speaking. She did not say former. She did not say retired. She did not say reluctant or afraid or still carrying something heavy from a runway in Syria 5 years ago that she had never been able to set down. We have experienced a medical emergency on the flight deck. I have assumed command of the aircraft and I will be flying us to Edwards Air Force Base in California. I need you to remain calm. I need you to follow every instruction from the cabin crew. She paused. We are in control. The cabin was quiet in a way that cabins almost never are. Not the quiet of sleep or distraction, the quiet of 300 people listening, really listening. I have over 10,000 flight hours, she said. I am certified on Boeing and Airbus platforms. I am a former Air Force pilot. You are in good hands. She released the intercom button. She set her grip on the yoke. Outside the cockpit glass, the Pacific went on forever, and the sky above it was clear and cold and brilliant, and somewhere below that blue horizon, a runway was being cleared, and emergency vehicles were beginning to move, and the world was mobilizing for whatever came next. Sarah Caldwell had not wanted to fly today, but she was flying. And the plane was answering her the way it had always answered her, the way every aircraft she had ever touched had answered her, with that particular willingness of a machine to be guided by hands that know what they are doing. Her hands knew. They had always known. The question, the one she had been asking herself for 5 years in an empty house in Ohio with a flight jacket hanging in a closet she wouldn't open, was whether she still deserved them. She didn't have an answer, but she had 36,000 feet and a crippled aircraft and 320 people who needed her to be something more than a woman on vacation. So she flew. The aircraft did not feel like an emergency. That was the strange thing. From inside the cockpit, with the engines pulling steady and the altimeter holding and the horizon sitting level in the glass, Pacific Airways Flight 801 felt like what it was supposed to be. A machine doing its job, a long crossing over water in clean air, the kind of flight that pilots describe in their logbooks with a single word: uneventful. But Sarah knew better than to trust the instruments alone. She could feel the aircraft the way you feel a conversation going wrong before anyone says the wrong thing. Something in the pressure of the yoke, something in the very slight resistance when she made small corrections, a heaviness that had no business being there at cruise altitude in still air. The hydraulic system was not failing, not yet, but it was not well. She kept her hands light. You never fought an aircraft that was still willing to fly. You guided it. You reasoned with it. You asked it through the 1,000 small conversations of pressure and trim and throttle to keep doing what it knew how to do for just a little longer. The captain had lost consciousness 3 minutes after she took the left seat. He had gone the way people go when the body is done negotiating. Not dramatically, not with warning, but with a kind of quiet finality, his head settling back against the seat and his breathing going deep and slow and beyond his control. She had checked his pulse. Strong enough. She had repositioned his oxygen mask and told herself he would be fine, which was the only thing she could afford to tell herself right now. The first officer had not moved. Sarah did not look at him again after the first time. There was nothing she could do for him and everything she could do for the 320 people behind her, and she was not a woman who spent energy on what she couldn't change. She had learned that the hard way, and she had learned it permanently. The radio was active. Edward's center had handed her off to a dedicated frequency with a single controller, whose job was now entirely Flight 801. His name was Stu Harwick, and his voice had the particular quality that good controllers shared with good pilots, an unhurried authority that communicated competence without performing it. He gave her altimeter settings and wind data and the weather picture between her current position and the California coast, and he did it clearly and without embellishment because she didn't need anything from him except information. She updated him on the hydraulic pressure. She gave him a fuel state. She told him her current descent rate and her estimate for the coast, and he fed all of it into the coordination happening on his end, the emergency vehicles being staged, the airspace being cleared, the notifications being made to people whose job it was to prepare for the various ways this could end. Sarah filed those possibilities and focused on the outcome she intended to produce. Behind the closed cockpit door, the cabin was doing what cabins do when 300 people have been told something terrifying by a voice that didn't sound terrified. They were holding on. They were holding each other. They were staring at the backs of headrests and out of small oval windows at the Pacific Ocean and doing the private arithmetic of mortality that human beings have been doing since the first of them looked up and understood that height has consequences. Ryan Beckett was managing it. She could hear the intercom clicks brief and regular as he coordinated with Leah Merritt and the rest of the crew. His voice, when it reached the passengers, was exactly what it needed to be. Calm without being dismissive. Honest without being catastrophizing. He told them to stay seated. He told them to keep their belts fastened. He told them the crew was trained and the pilot was experienced, and that following instructions was the only job anyone in the cabin needed to do right now. He did not tell them what he was thinking. Neither did Sarah. 40 minutes into the flight from Honolulu, Ryan Beckett had discovered something about himself that he would spend a long time afterward processing. He had discovered that he was capable of functioning at full professional capacity while carrying a weight in his chest that he could not put down and could not look at directly, a weight that had no name yet, because the words for it were still forming somewhere in the back of his mind. It had started with a name tag. He had gone to the cockpit to check on Sarah 20 minutes after she took command. Not because he doubted her. He had stopped doubting her within 30 seconds of watching her work. He went because it was his job to be useful, and he had nothing else to offer except presence, the small gesture of another person letting you know that you are not entirely alone. She had not needed his presence. She had not needed anything from him except for him to stay out of the way and keep the cabin from coming apart, and he was doing that. But he went anyway, and he pushed the cockpit door open, and he stood for a moment in the threshold watching her hands move over the controls with the fluency of someone who had been doing this so long it had stopped being a skill and become an extension of will. She did not look up. Her attention was on the aircraft, all of it, every gram. And Ryan's eyes had moved the way eyes do when they are looking for something to settle on in a room full of things they don't fully understand, and they settled on the first officer in the right seat. On the young man with dark hair who had the careful professionalism of someone still in his first years of the mom, still paying full attention to everything, because nothing had yet become routine enough to stop demanding it. His name tag was visible from the doorway. James Holt, first officer. Ryan looked at it for a moment. Something moved in his mind, not recognition exactly, but the early tremor of it, like the feeling you get when a name is almost but not quite familiar, when the brain is running a search you didn't consciously initiate. Holt. He had seen that name recently. His eyes moved to Sarah's canvas bag on the floor by the captain's seat. The front pocket was slightly open. He could see the edge of something inside. The corner of a photograph. He should not have touched it. He knew that even as he was doing it. His fingers found the corner anyway and drew it out just far enough to see what it was. A photograph. Two people in flight suits, old enough to have that warmth that photographs get from being handled too many times. He turned it over without looking at it longer than necessary. The handwriting on the back was loose and confident, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who thinks faster than they transcribe. We made it out. For now, D. He stood there with the single initial. D. Holt, James Holt. First officer was 27 years old. Ryan knew this from the crew manifest. If this man had an older brother, that brother would be in his early 30s. Old enough to have been in the military in 2019. Old enough to have been flying aircraft like the one in that photograph. Old enough to have known Sarah Caldwell in whatever capacity two people in the same flight suit know each other. Old enough to have died. Ryan did not know for certain. He was constructing a story from very few pieces, and he understood that stories built from very few pieces were often wrong. But the weight in his chest had a name now, and the name was grief anticipatory and secondhand and entirely out of place in a cockpit at 36,000 feet, but real in the way that all uninvited things are real. He slid the photograph back into the front pocket of the bag. He straightened up. He looked at Sarah Caldwell, who was still working, still entirely present in the aircraft, still doing with complete focus the thing that was keeping every person on this plane alive. She did not know. Ryan Beckett stood in the doorway of that cockpit for 3 more seconds. He breathed in, he breathed out. He filed everything he had just understood into a place where it could not interfere with what he had to do next. And then he turned around and walked back into the cabin and went back to work. He sat in the forward jump seat for a moment before standing again. His hand pressed flat against his chest pocket, holding it there, briefly feeling nothing through the fabric because the photograph was back in Sarah's bag. He could not have said why he was doing it. He did not try. He stood up. He went back to his passengers. He kept going. The F-16 appeared at roughly the same moment the hydraulic problem became impossible to ignore. Sarah saw them in the peripheral sweep of her instrument scan, 2 shapes resolving out of the high blue to the northwest, flying a converging course with the precise geometry of military escort. She did not have to look at their profiles to know what they were. The proportions were in her muscle memory. She had flown beside aircraft like these for 10 years. She had been one of the people in them. They pulled up on either side of Flight 801 with the smooth confidence of pilots who owned this part of the sky. Their wing markings were Edwards. They were close enough for Sarah to see the cockpit glass and close enough for the pilots inside to see her. She could imagine what they saw. A commercial Boeing, a woman in the left seat, no uniform, a canvas bag on the floor. She wondered what they were making of it. She didn't have to wonder long. The radio crackled on the emergency frequency. Flight 801, this is Tango Flight Lead. We're alongside to escort. State your status. Tango Lead, this is Flight 801, Sarah said. Both flight deck crew are incapacitated. I have manual control, currently managing a hydraulic pressure loss on System 2 and a flight control response issue. Estimating Edwards in approximately 30 minutes. A pause, not a long pause. A 3-second pause, which on a military frequency means something different than 3 seconds anywhere else. On a military frequency, 3 seconds is the sound of someone recalibrating. The voice that came back was measured, but there was something underneath it. Flight 801, can you confirm the name you gave Edwards Center? Sarah Caldwell. Confirmed. Another pause. Shorter. Ghost talk. It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of the man confirming something he already knew the answer to. Sarah said nothing. This is Captain Garrett Briggs, the voice continued. I flew out of Bagram in 2017. You wouldn't remember me, but I remember you. You pulled a full-burn intercept at night in a crosswind that my whole squadron said was unsurvivable. Then you landed clean. Sarah kept her eyes on the instruments. I remember the landing, she said. Yes, ma'am, I figured you would. A beat. I've told that story at every squadron dinner for 7 years, and I just told Edwards that Ghost Talk is on the stick. His voice had found its register now, past surprise and into something steadier. They asked me if I trusted it. I told them to clear the runway. Sarah did not let herself feel the thing that tried to move through her chest at that. Appreciate the escort, Briggs, she said. Hold your current position and keep clear of my wingtip. I may need to make corrections. Understood. We're with you. She keyed off and went back to the aircraft. The hydraulic problem was getting worse. System 2 was declining in the gradual uneven way of systems stressed beyond their design parameters. She had been watching the pressure numbers for 20 minutes. System 2 controlled the left inboard flight surfaces and the nose gear steering actuator. At the pressure she was seeing now, she had partial function. At the pressure she would likely see by the time she reached Edwards, she would have less. She could manage that. What she could not manage as cleanly was the flap situation. She reached for the flap handle and moved it to 15 degrees. The left flap extended normally. The right flap moved to 22 degrees and stopped. She tried it again. 22 degrees. The actuator was reading a jam, mechanical obstruction somewhere in the right outboard track. She cycled it twice more with the same result and then stopped cycling it because you don't keep asking a broken thing to be unbroken. You accept what you have and you build a plan around it. What she had was asymmetrical lift. The aircraft wanted to pull right. It was doing it subtly now at cruise speed, a gentle, persistent pressure that she was countering with left aileron input and left rudder. Her foot braced on the pedal as muscles of her lower leg beginning the long, slow burn of sustained exertion. At approach speed with the left flap fully extended and the right at 22, the asymmetry would be more pronounced. She would need more rudder, more aileron, more of everything. She would need her body to keep doing what it was doing for another 25 minutes. Her right leg was beginning to argue. She pressed the rudder and held it and breathed and looked at the horizon. Ryan Beckett had been in aviation for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had developed what he thought of as a professional relationship with fear. Not the elimination of it. You didn't eliminate it. You learned where it lived, and you learned to work around it. You just didn't put anything near that heat that you couldn't afford to lose. He moved through the cabin with a thoroughness that was partly professional and partly the need to keep moving. He checked seatbelts. He redistributed oxygen masks. He spoke in a low, steady voice to the people who met his eyes and said nothing to the ones who had found a private space inside themselves and were managing from there. There was a woman in row 14 who was praying. Her lips moved without sound, and her hands were flat on her thighs and her eyes were closed. Ryan adjusted the shade on the window beside her and moved on without disturbing her. There was a man in row 19 who had been a pilot once. Prop planes, he said, 30 years ago. Small stuff. Cessnas. But I know enough to know she's doing something up there that isn't easy. Ryan agreed that she was. There was a child in row 7, a girl of about 5, who had fallen asleep against her mother's arm with the magnificent indifference to catastrophe that only very young children and the very old can achieve. Her mother was not asleep. Her mother was staring at the seat back in front of her with the focused stillness of someone who had made a decision to hold it together and was keeping that decision one breath at a time. Ryan gave her a bottle of water and a look that tried to say everything that words in a cabin full of listening people could not say. She took the water and nodded and went back to holding it together. He was passing the forward galley on his third sweep of the cabin when the secondary communication line crackled. The channel that ran directly from ground operations to the cabin crew, which Ryan had used exactly twice in his career. He picked up. The voice on the other end was clipped and official. This is Agent Marcus Webb, National Transportation Safety Board, coordinating with the FBI field office in Los Angeles. I need to speak with whoever is managing the cabin on Flight 801. This is Ryan Beckett, Senior Flight Attendant. I need you to relay a message to your pilot. Can she take a communication on the dedicated emergency channel, frequency 121.775? I'll tell her. Ryan went to the cockpit. He knocked once. He pushed the door open. Sarah was exactly as he had left her. Hands on the yoke, eyes moving in their precise, professional sweep. The two F-16IS were visible at the edge of the view, one off each wing hanging there with the patience of machines that had been told to stay. There's a federal agent asking to speak with you, Ryan said. NTSB, coordinating with FBI, frequency 121.775. She did not look up. Get me the frequency. He reached across and dialed it. She keyed the radio. Flight 801, this is Caldwell. Captain Caldwell, this is Agent Marcus Webb, NTSB. We've been conducting a rapid review of the maintenance records for this aircraft since your emergency declaration. I need to make you aware of something. Go ahead. The cockpit air quality sensor, the device that should have detected contamination in the avionics bay ventilation and triggered an automatic alarm, that sensor was deactivated. It was not a malfunction. The deactivation was performed manually during a scheduled maintenance inspection 4 days ago by a technician named Craig Deaver. Deaver was terminated by the airline 3 weeks before the inspection he was not authorized to be performing. The cockpit was very quiet for a moment. You're telling me the sensor was disabled on purpose, Sarah said, Mom. We're telling you the evidence is consistent with that conclusion. There is an ongoing investigation and no final determination has been made. But Captain, you need to understand that this aircraft was not adequately protected from the condition that incapacitated your crew, and the absence of that protection appears to have been deliberate. Sarah looked at the instruments. She thought about the blank display she had found in the cockpit when she first sat down, the indicator that was dark before she ever touched a switch. She had known something was wrong with that panel the moment she saw it. Now she knew the shape of what was wrong. Is there anything in that information that changes what I need to do in the next 20 minutes? Webb paused. No. Then I'll be available for your investigation after I land this aircraft. She keyed off. She did not look at Ryan, but she was aware of him in the doorway, aware of the particular quality of his silence, the silence of someone who understood that this was not the moment. "Go back to the cabin," she said. "Start your brace briefing. Give them the full procedure. I want them ready." "How long?" 20 minutes to approach, maybe less." She made an adjustment to the throttle, feeling the engines respond. "Tell them it's going to be loud. Tell them not to be scared of loud." Ryan stayed in the doorway for one more second. He was looking at the first officer, at the young man in the right seat who had not moved, who was still breathing, still alive, still held in the deep suspension of a body waiting for the contamination to clear. Sarah noticed. She noticed everything. "Go," she said. He went. The California coast came up below the clouds in pieces. First, the color change in the water from the deep Pacific blue to something shallower and greener and more complicated. Then the brown edge of the coast itself, and then the land, the high desert of the Mojave, reaching back from the water like something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. Sarah had flown into Edwards twice before in her career, both times in an F-15, both times in conditions that had nothing in common with this morning. But the geography was in her memory, and memory built on the kind of repetition that military flying required was a form of precision. She knew where the runway was before she could see it. Stu Harwick came back on frequency. "Flight 801, you are 22 miles from the field. Confirm you have the airport in sight or require vectors." "Require vectors. I don't want to waste a correction." "Copy. Turn right heading 084. You'll intercept the localizer in approximately 8 miles. Wind is 8 knots from the northwest. Runway 22 at left length 15,200 feet. Emergency equipment is in position." 15,000 feet of runway. She was going to need most of it. She began the turn. The aircraft responded with the particular heaviness of an asymmetrically loaded machine, being asked to do something its current condition complicated. She felt the pull in the rudder. Her right leg braced harder. The burn was significant now. The deep fatigue of sustained exertion that did not announce itself with sharp pain, but with a growing insistence that became its own kind of argument. She held the turn. She leveled. She lined up on the heading. "Tango lead," she said on the escort frequency. "I'm going to need you to break off at 5 miles. I'll have the field by then, and I need the approach clear." Garrett Briggs came back without hesitation. "Understood. We'll hold at 5 and watch you in. You've got this ghost talk." She did not respond to the call sign, but she heard it. She felt it in the place where she had spent 5 years telling herself that person was gone. The descent continued. 16,000 feet. 14. The altimeter unwound with the patience of a clock that didn't care what was happening in the cockpit, just what was true. She reached for the flap handle again. Left side full extension, right side 22 degrees and no further. She had known this was coming and had been preparing for it for 20 minutes, calculating the rudder input she would need. The aileron she would hold, the way the aircraft's natural tendency to roll right would have to be countered through the entire approach, with nothing but her own body as the counterweight. She adjusted. She trimmed. She breathed. Her right leg was running out of arguments. "Flight 801, you are 10 miles from the field. Confirm gear down and landing checklist." "Gear coming down now." She reached for the landing gear handle and moved it to the down position. The aircraft shuddered as 300 pounds of landing gear dropped into the airstream, and the hydraulics worked to lock everything into place. 3 green lights. Gear down, locked. She let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she'd realized. "Gear is down and indicating," she told Edwards. 3 greens. "Copy that, Flight 801. You are 8 miles. You are on glide path." She was on glide path, which was true. She was also flying a crippled aircraft with one leg going numb, and a runway that was still 7 miles away, and a cabin full of people who were doing exactly what she had asked them to do, which was trust her. She had never taken that lightly. Not once in 10 years, and not now. The Mojave filled the cockpit, glass tan and flat and enormous. The airbase resolving out of it as a cluster of buildings and aprons in the long gray geometry of runway 22 left, and beside it the lines of emergency vehicles, the red and white lights of fire trucks and ambulances and hazmat units parked in their waiting rows, like a city that had assembled itself for exactly this moment. She could see the runway clearly now. Garrett Briggs broke off at 5 miles, pulling away in a clean banking turn that took him out of her approach corridor. She didn't watch him go. She was already inside the final approach, already in the place where all the calculation finished, and what remained was just flying. The radio went quiet. Edwards had given her everything they had to give. The rest was hers. Ryan Beckett's voice came over the intercom from the cabin. "Brace for landing." She could hear in it that he had done exactly what she asked. His passengers were in position. His crew was ready. 30 seconds later, he pressed the intercom key one more time. He held it open for 2 seconds without speaking, and through the channel, she heard the cabin. She heard the sound of 300 people breathing together in the particular stillness of human beings who have decided to do the only thing available to them, which was to hold on and believe in someone they had met an hour ago and had no reason to trust except that her voice had told them to. She heard them. She flew. The runway was a mile out when the right rudder pedal gave her the full extent of what she was dealing with. The asymmetric lift at this speed, at this configuration, was pulling the nose right with a persistence that required everything her right leg had left. And her right leg, which had been doing this for 20 minutes, was approaching the end of what it could give. She could feel the edge of it, not in pain exactly, but in the quality of the effort, the way the last mile of any hard thing has a different texture from all the miles before it. She pressed harder. She had more. Not much, but more. The runway center line came up in the glass, and she aligned with it, and she held it, and she did not let herself think about anything except this moment, and this line, and these hands, and this aircraft, and the 100,000 hours of repetition that had built in her, a kind of knowledge that lived below thought and above instinct, in the place where real competence lives, where you stop being someone who knows how to do something and become someone who simply does it. The threshold markings appeared at the near end of the runway. She brought the nose up, she cut the throttle, the aircraft settled, and then the wheels touched. Not gently. She had not promised gentle. She had promised heavy, and she delivered it. The main gear hit this concrete with a force that went through the airframe and through the seats and through 320 bodies simultaneously, a single shared impact that said, "We are here, we have arrived, this is the ground, and we are on it." The nose came down. She was already on the brakes manual. Braking, feeling the aircraft resist, and then yield the tires smoking against the runway, the nose gear pulling right, and her correcting for it with what her right leg had left, which turned out to be just enough. The aircraft slowed. It slowed the way large things slow, not instantly, not gracefully, but with the massive gradual honesty of something that has been moving very fast for a very long time and is now choosing to stop. The emergency net at the end of the runway filled the cockpit glass. She braked harder. The aircraft stopped. 20 feet from the net, in the cabin behind her, a child was crying. And then someone started to clap. And then everyone did. Sarah Caldwell sat in the left seat of Pacific Airways Flight 801, with her hands still on the yoke and her right foot still on the rudder pedal, and her eyes still moving across the instrument panel in the pattern they had been moving in for the last 90 minutes, checking and rechecking and confirming the things she had just done. The way you reread a sentence you are not certain you read correctly. The engine spooled down, the instruments settled. The applause continued behind the closed cockpit door, and outside the cockpit glass, the emergency vehicles were already moving red and white lights cutting across the morning desert, coming toward her from both sides of the runway with the speed of people who had been waiting and were now done waiting. She took her hands off the yoke. She sat back. She looked at the desert through the glass, flat and brown and brilliant in the morning light, the kind of landscape that didn't apologize for anything, that just was what it was, and that had been here before her and would be here after, and did not need her to have done anything remarkable to keep existing. She found that restful in a way she couldn't fully explain. In the right seat, the first officer breathed. His name was James Holt, and she did not know yet what that meant. She keyed the intercom for the last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Caldwell. We are on the ground at Edwards Air Force Base. Emergency crews are alongside. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the crew instructs you otherwise." She paused. "It has been an honor to fly with you today." She set down the handset. Outside, the first of the emergency vehicles reached the aircraft. The world was coming back in, all of it, but not yet. For now, there was only the desert and the silence of an aircraft that had carried everything asked of it and arrived, and a woman in the left seat who had done the same. For now, that was enough. The first thing they did was open the doors, not the cockpit door. The cabin doors, the rear ones first, the way protocol required, and the air that came in was desert air, dry and sharp and carrying the particular clarity of high-altitude California morning, the kind of air that had never been breathed before by anyone and would never be breathed again, in quite this combination of molecules in motion. 320 people took that first breath of outside air simultaneously, and the sound they made was not applause, and it was not crying, and it was not anything that would translate cleanly into language. It was the sound of bodies remembering that they were alive, which is a sound most people only hear once or twice in a life, and never forget after. Sarah heard it through the cockpit door. She sat where she was. The emergency crews had boarded within 2 minutes of the aircraft, stopping paramedics first, then hazmat in their full protective gear, then base personnel moving with the organized urgency of people who had drilled for this and were discovering that the drill, however thorough, had not fully prepared them for the reality of a commercial aircraft on their runway with a woman in the captain's seat who was not the captain. She answered their first questions without turning around. Pilot identification, medical status of flight deck crew, last known fuel state, hydraulic system condition. She gave them everything they needed in the order they needed it, efficiently and without embellishment. When the lead paramedic reached the cockpit and began working on the first officer, Sarah finally stood. She stood slowly, not from weakness, though her right leg registered a complaint she acknowledged and set aside. She stood slowly because the transition from the person responsible for everything to the person responsible for nothing required a moment she had learned over the years to take deliberately. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor. She looked at the first officer one more time. James Holt, 27 years old. His color was better now. The oxygen had been working for 40 minutes, and it showed the flush of hypoxia giving way to something closer to normal, his breathing deeper and more regular. One of the paramedics had a hand on his wrist and was counting, and the number on his face was a good number, the number of someone who was going to be fine. She did not know yet that she knew him. She turned and walked out of the cockpit. The cabin was largely empty by the time she reached the aisle. The rear rows already deplaned through the back doors, the middle rows moving in the careful, slightly dazed shuffle of people who were not entirely trusting their legs yet. Ryan Beckett was at the forward door directing the remaining passengers with the precise economy of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 90 minutes and had decided through sheer professionalism that the adrenaline could wait until everyone was safely off the aircraft. He saw her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something layered and complicated that lived behind his professional composure, and then he gave her a single nod, the kind of nod that means more than it looks like, and went back to his passengers. Sarah walked to the door and stepped out into the California morning. The brightness was immediate and total as desert sun at 9 in the morning, having made its decision about the day and committed to it fully. She stood at the top of the mobile stairs and looked out across the airfield. The emergency vehicles had arranged themselves along both sides of the runway in the ordered formation of a response that had been waiting and was now executing. Beyond the perimeter fence, there were cameras. She had expected them. News traveled faster than aircraft now, and the story of a passenger taking control of a commercial flight was the kind of story that moved at the speed of a text message. She understood that the life she had been living for 5 years, the quiet, unremarkable life of a woman who had walked away from everything she was, that life had ended somewhere over the Pacific. She walked down the stairs. Agent Marcus Webb met her at the bottom. He was younger than his voice had suggested, mid-40s, with the careful grooming of a federal official who had learned that appearance communicated authority before words could. He had a tablet under his arm and a look on his face that was professional and thorough, and underneath both of those things, genuinely relieved. He shook her hand. "Captain Caldwell, I want to be the first person to say that what you did this morning was extraordinary. I'd prefer you to be the first person to tell me the status of the flight crew," she said. He took that without offense. "Captain Morrison is conscious and stable. He'll be transferred to Antelope Valley Hospital within the hour. The first officer is still unconscious, but his vitals are strong. The medical team expects a full recovery for both." Sarah nodded. "And the investigation?" Webb fell into step beside her as a base liaison directed them toward the mobile command vehicle. Inside it smelled like coffee and electronics and the particular tension of a situation that was still being processed. "We've confirmed the mechanism of incapacitation," Webb said, pulling up a technical diagram on his tablet. "A slow accumulation of fumes from the avionics bay conducted through a gap in the cockpit ventilation system. Under normal circumstances, the air quality sensor would have detected elevated levels within 15 minutes and triggered both an audible alarm and a ventilation redirect. The sensor that was manually disabled," Sarah said. "Yes." He met her eyes. "We have Craig Deaver on video in the maintenance bay 4 days ago. He had been terminated 3 weeks prior. He used a former colleague's access badge to enter the facility. He was in that bay for 11 minutes. Long enough." "Why?" Webb paused. "Not because he didn't have the answer, because the answer was the kind that resisted simple framing. Deaver filed a wrongful termination suit 6 months ago. It was dismissed. He filed an appeal. That was dismissed as well. He had been with Pacific Airways for 14 years. Webb looked at the diagram. We found a journal. It's consistent with someone who had decided that if the institution wouldn't hear him, he would make himself heard another way. He didn't target a specific flight. He targeted a specific aircraft. He didn't know who would be on it. Sarah looked at that for a moment. The terrible arithmetic of a man's grievance and 320 people who happened to be on the wrong aircraft on the wrong Friday morning. He's in custody. Arrested this morning. Federal charges. Sarah looked out the narrow window of the command vehicle at the aircraft sitting on the runway. From this angle, it looked entirely ordinary. Silver fuselage, Pacific Airways livery. The kind of machine that flew this route 3 times a week without incident, without anyone in row 23 needing to know what a hydraulic pressure reading meant. I'll give you whatever you need for the investigation, she said. Full statement, technical debrief, flight data walkthrough, whatever is useful. We'll need a few days to compile the flight data recorder information before the formal debrief. Webb set his tablet down and looked at her directly. I've been doing this for 18 years. I've worked engine failures, structural events, pilot incapacitation. I have never in 18 years seen anything remotely like what you did this morning. He held her gaze. How did you know you could do it? Sarah thought about that honestly. I didn't, she said. I just knew I was the only one who had a chance. The passengers from Flight 801 were being processed in a hangar at the far end of the apron, a large facility converted into a temporary reception area with folding chairs and water and blankets, and a team of counselors from the base. Sarah had been advised by the base liaison that it might be better to delay her appearance, that the passengers were still in an elevated emotional state. She had listened to this advice and then walked to the hangar anyway because she had her own views about obligation, and this was one of them. The room was large, and the light was the flat, functional light of a working facility, and 300 people in folding chairs, with blankets around their shoulders, looked simultaneously like a crowd, and like something much smaller and more vulnerable than a crowd. Some were talking, some were on phones. A woman near the entrance was crying in the thorough, unself-conscious way of someone who had held it together for as long as holding it together was required and had now released the hold. People noticed Sarah when she walked in. It moved through the room in the way things move through rooms when something significant has happened and the person most connected to it has arrived. Not a ripple, more like a change in pressure. Heads turning in sequence, a recognition traveling from person to person. She did not stop walking. She moved through the room without performance, without announcement, just present and deliberate. She stopped at a chair beside an elderly woman who was sitting alone with a paper cup of water she had not touched. The woman looked at her. She was in her late 70s, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been beautiful for a long time and had become something more interesting than beautiful as the years accumulated. My grandson was born 2 days ago, she said. I was going home to meet him. Sarah sat in the chair beside her. What's his name? Thomas, after my husband. That's a good name. The woman reached out and put her hand over Sarah's hand, where it rested on her knee. Her grip was firm. The grip of someone who wanted to convey something specific and was choosing touch because words were insufficient. Thank you, she said, not with drama, with the directness of someone stating a fact. Sarah did not deflect it. She had spent years deflecting things that were meant for her, and she was beginning to understand that deflection was its own kind of dishonesty. Go meet Thomas, she said. She stayed in the hangar for an hour. She did not make a speech. She did not position herself at the front of the room. She moved through it, doing what was needed in the place it was needed, and what was needed here was simply for the person who had flown them to be visible and ordinary, to prove by her presence that the extraordinary thing was over, and that what came next was the unremarkable business of living. Ryan Beckett found her near the exit. He looked like a man who had been awake for 48 hours and had just discovered a 31st hour he didn't know existed. He had shed his uniform jacket and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was a quality about him of something stripped down to its essentials, all professional surface burned away by the morning. He stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his chest pocket and drew out the photograph. He held it with both hands and looked at it and then looked at her. And Sarah understood from the specific quality of his expression, something between apology and grief, that what was coming was not small. I found this in your bag, he said. When I came to the cockpit, I shouldn't have looked. I'm sorry. She looked at the photograph. She looked at his face. Tell me, she said. He told her about the name tag. He told her about the last name. He told her about the handwriting on the back and the initial D and the way things had assembled themselves in his mind into a conclusion he had spent the rest of the flight hoping was wrong. When he finished, Sarah stood very still. The hangar noise continued around them. Somewhere across the room, a child was laughing. The world was doing what the world does, proceeding indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted irrevocably inside a person standing near the exit. "The first officer," she said, "James Holt." "Yes." She looked at the photograph in Ryan's hands. She looked at D, in the period after it, in the way the ink had faded at the corners from 5 years of handling. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She took the photograph, she put it in her pocket, and she went to find James Holt. The base medical facility was a low building behind the main administration complex, clean and efficiently staffed. The first officer had been moved there from the aircraft within the first half hour, and by the time Sarah arrived, he had been there long enough for the oxygen to have done its full work. He was awake. She knew this before she reached his room, because she could hear him in the hallway, a young man's voice in conversation with a medical staff member, the voice of someone piecing themselves back together, asking questions, orienting to place and time and the facts of what had happened. She stopped outside the door. She had been in more difficult situations than this. She had walked into briefing rooms where she was the only person who knew the mission had gone wrong. She had stood at the edge of a runway in Syria in the late afternoon light and done the accounting. She had sat across from a casualty officer and listened to the official language for the things she had already known in the unspoken language of the radio going silent. She had done harder things than walking through a door. She walked through the door. James Holt was sitting up in the hospital bed with the posture of someone who had just demonstrated to a medical professional that they could sit up without assistance. He was young in the way that first officers are young, not naive, but not yet carrying the accumulated weight of the years that make a face look like it belongs to someone who has survived a few things. His dark hair was disordered from the oxygen mask, and he had the pallor of someone recently unconscious, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, and he knew who she was. She could see it in the way his expression reorganized itself, not with shock, but with the particular quality of recognition, meeting emotion of a moment arriving that has been anticipated without being expected. "Captain Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Holt." She crossed the room and stood at the foot of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone turned me off and back on again." He said it without self-pity, a fact delivered as such. "They told me what happened, what you did." He looked at her steadily. "The whole aircraft." "The whole aircraft," she agreed. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who both know something that hasn't been said yet and are finding the shape of the moment that contains it. "My brother used to talk about you," James said. Sarah held that sentence carefully, the way you hold something fragile from underneath with both hands. "He said you were the best pilot he ever flew with," James continued. His voice was even. She understood that he had been carrying this for a long time and had learned to carry it without it being audible in every word. "He said you had a quality in the air that he'd never seen in anyone else. He said it wasn't skill exactly, or not only skill. He said it was that you cared about getting everyone home, that you counted them every single time before you took off and after you landed, and if the numbers didn't match, you didn't leave." Sarah did not trust herself to speak. "He died in Syria," James said, "in 2019. You know that." "Yes." "I know you do." He looked at her without accusation, with something that was harder to receive than accusation because it was entirely free of it. "He wrote letters before every deployment. He gave them to a friend on base with instructions, if something happened. Most of them went to family. There was one that wasn't for family." He reached toward the small table beside the bed where a nurse had placed the few items from his flight bag. Underneath them was an envelope, cream-colored letter-sized, its seal long since broken, its edges worn soft from being handled and replaced and handled again. He held it out to her. "He told his friend I'd find a way to get it to you," James said. "His friend tried. He didn't know where you'd gone. After you retired, you were just gone." He paused. "I've been carrying it for 4 years. I became a pilot, and I thought maybe someday I'd be in the same room as you. I didn't think it would be like this." Sarah took the envelope. She looked at the handwriting on the front. She knew every angle of it. She had known it from briefing notes and logbooks and the back of a photograph she had carried for 5 years. Her name in his hand. She did not open it immediately. She held it in both hands and breathed and understood that this was one of the moments that a life pivots on, that she would remember the quality of the light in this room and the sound of the bass outside the window and the expression on this young man's face for as long as she had a life to remember it with. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, the penmanship of someone who had grown up before typing replaced thinking through your fingers. She read it privately, each line arriving and settling before the next one came. He wrote about the mission, He wrote about the decision he had made in the air that day, the one she had never known about, the one that had taken him out of position to cover someone else and left her without a wingman in the window that mattered. He wrote that it had been his call, entirely his, made in the 3 seconds available to him, and made because he believed it was right and would make it again, even knowing the outcome. He wrote, "I need you to hear that it was not your fault. I need you to hear it from me because I know you have been arguing with a version of events that leaves you responsible for something you did not do and could not have changed." He wrote about the sky. He wrote about what it meant to him to fly, not the technical dimension of it, not the career of it, but the essential fact of being a person who moved through the air and found in that movement something that could not be found on the ground, a clarity, a simplicity, a version of yourself that was only available at altitude. He wrote, "If Ghost Hawk is still flying, tell her I never blamed her. Tell her the sky isn't the place where I died. It's the place where I was most alive. Don't let her leave it because of me." And at the bottom, in the same handwriting that had written, "For now, the same pen, the same loops. The numbers always matched when you were flying. That's the thing I want you to know." Sarah folded the letter. She sat in the chair beside James Holt's bed, and she held the envelope in both hands, and she did not look at anything for a while, just down at the envelope, at her own hands around it, at the particular reality of something that had been true for 5 years and was only now being delivered. James let her sit. He was his brother's brother in that way. The same understanding of when a person needed to be left to something. After a while, Sarah reached into her pocket and took out the photograph. She set it on the table beside the bed. She set the letter beside it. Two pieces of the same story from opposite ends meeting on a surface in a room in the California desert. "He was the best wingman I ever had," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. But there was something in it now that had not been there before, something that had come through from the other side of steady, from the place beyond control where things were simply true. James looked at the photograph. He looked at his brother laughing beside an F-15. "Yeah," he said. "He was like that with everyone." Sarah stood up. She put the photograph back in her pocket against her heart, where it had lived for 5 years and where it would live for the rest of whatever came next. She left the letter on the table for James because it was his too, had always been his too. At the door, she stopped. "When you're back in the air," she said without turning around, "fly the way he talked about it." How did he talk about it? Like it mattered. She walked out into the hallway. She walked to the end of it and stood at the window and looked out at the desert for a long time. And what moved through her was not grief, or not only grief. It was something that had been stored under pressure for 5 years, finally finding a release valve, not exploding, just releasing the slow and complete exhale of something that had been held past the time for holding it. She breathed out. She breathed in. She was still standing at the window when Colonel Frank Harmon found her. He had driven from the Pentagon, which was the kind of thing Frank Harmon did, without announcement or explanation. He arrived the way he had always arrived, with the economy of someone for whom preparation was habitual, and entrance was just a function of being wherever he needed to be when he needed to be there. He was older than she remembered from the last time she had seen him, which was 5.5 years ago in a hallway at Langley, where she had handed him her resignation, and he had accepted it without argument, which had been, she understood now, his form of respect. He found her at the window, and he stood beside her and looked out at the same desert for a moment before he spoke. "Hell of a morning," he said. "Yes. Runway 22. Left is going to have to be resurfaced. You left a considerable amount of tire on it." She almost smiled. They stood side by side for another moment, in the way of people who have shared enough history that silence between them is a form of communication. Then Harmon reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and drew something out and held it in his palm between them. Metal wings. Small. The kind issued to Air Force pilots on certification, worn on the left chest of the uniform above the name tape. Hers. She knew them by the small scratch on the lower left pinion, where she had knocked them against a fuel gauge housing in an F-15 cockpit her second year, and had never had them replaced because the scratch was accurate and replacements wouldn't have been. "You turned these in," Harmon said. "I did. I kept them." He didn't offer a reason. He didn't have to. She understood that it was the same impulse that had made James Holt carry an envelope for 4 years. The refusal to let go of something that wasn't finished. "There's talk of a formal commendation," Harmon said. "FAA. Probably as you know, you'll be called to Washington." "I know. I told them you wouldn't want a ceremony." "You were right. I told them you'd accept a letter and a handshake." "That's generous. I'll take the letter." Harmon closed his hand around the wings for a moment, then opened it again and held them out to her. She looked at them in his palm. She picked them up. They were exactly as heavy as she remembered, which is to say not heavy at all. The weight of a small piece of stamped metal, the weight of nothing except what they represented, which was not nothing at all. She put them in her pocket beside the photograph. Harmon nodded once, the nod of a man who has done what he came to do and is at peace with it. The Air Force is reviewing options, he said. If you ever wanted to come back in any capacity, consulting instruction evaluation. Nothing operational. Nothing that would require you to be anyone you don't want to be. I'll think about it. That's more than you said last time. He pulled his jacket straight. That's enough. He left the way he had arrived without performance, without looking back. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the window in the desert, and after a while she stopped seeing the desert and started seeing what was beyond it. The long, flat interior of the country, the plains and the river valleys, and somewhere in Ohio, a small airfield and a Cessna. 172 and a retired instructor named Pete Callahan, who had left her a voicemail 3 months ago, asking if she ever wanted to take a plane up, just for the sake of it, just to remember what it felt like. She had not returned the call. She was going to return it now. The debrief with Agent Webb took 4 hours and covered everything from the moment she had first noticed the vibration in her seat to the final brake application on runway 22 left. She gave him the technical detail he needed in the chronological sequence his report required, and at the end she signed 3 documents and was given 2 business cards and told that her cooperation would be appreciated. She told him she would cooperate fully. She meant it. The media request list, which the base's public affairs office delivered to her on a printed sheet at the end of the afternoon, ran to 37 outlets. Morning shows, cable news networks, newspapers, podcast producers, a documentary company, and 4 separate entities describing themselves as literary agents. She read the list carefully. She gave it back. The public affairs officer looked at her with the professional composure of someone absorbing a disappointment they had been trained for. "Is there anything you would like us to communicate on your behalf?" he asked. Sarah thought about it. "Tell them the aircraft is out of service pending inspection," she said. "Tell them the crew is recovering. Tell them the passengers are safe." She handed him back the list. "Everything else that matters is in the flight data recorder." And she left the base at 6 in the evening, driven by a liaison officer, to a hotel in Lancaster. The room was clean and quiet and faced away from the road. She set her bag on the bed and sat beside it. Her phone had 47 missed calls. She put it face down on the nightstand and opened the front pocket of her bag instead. The envelope from Leah Merritt was there. Ryan Beckett had brought it to her at the hangar before she left, a plain white envelope with Captain Caldwell written on the front. Inside was a single folded page. "I just got off the phone with the Flight Academy in Phoenix. They have an open spot in the January cohort. I told them I had a recommendation from the best pilot I'd ever seen fly. They asked who. I told them. There was a long pause. Then they said, if you can get us a letter from Sarah Caldwell, the spot is yours. I don't know if that's the kind of thing you do anymore. I don't know anything about your life outside of what happened this morning. But I know that what you did up there changed something in me that I don't think is going to change back. And I know that I want to fly. I've always wanted to fly. I just needed to see someone do it the way you did it to understand that wanting is enough of a reason. No pressure. I mean that. Whatever you're doing next, thank you for today." Leah Sarah read it twice. She found a pen in the hotel desk drawer, a sheet of hotel stationery. She sat at the desk and she wrote a letter of recommendation for Leah Merritt, and she wrote it the way she wrote everything, without unnecessary words. Each sentence doing the work of 3, the specific and honest account of what she had observed in a young woman over the course of 90 minutes in a crisis that would have undone people with twice her experience. She sealed it. She would mail it in the morning. She sat at the desk for a while after that, not doing anything, just sitting with her hand flat on the surface beside the hotel pen, thinking about the last time she had felt the particular lightness of a thing set down that had been carried too long. She could not remember that time. She took the photograph out of her pocket. She looked at Daniel Holt laughing beside the F-15. For the first time in 5 years, the image did not carry the weight of the thing that came after it. It carried only itself. 2 people young and alive on a tarmac in the full unreasonable optimism of a morning when everything was still possible, and both of them knowing it and one of them showing it in his face. She turned the photograph over. "We made it out. For now, D." She had always read that as an ending. The "for now" as the thing that negated everything before it. The escape that wasn't really an escape, the relief already shadowed by what was coming. She read it differently now. "We made it out." That was the sentence. That was what he was saying. On that day and that moment, they had made it out. And the for now was not a cancellation of that fact. It was just honesty about what all moments are. Temporary. Finite. True while they last, and true after they end, the truth of them unchanged by what comes next. She had made it out of Syria too. She had carried it wrong, but she had made it out. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She picked up her phone. She found Pete Callahan's number in her contacts and looked at his name and thought about the airfield outside Columbus and the Cessna 172 and the particular quality of altitude on a clear Ohio morning, the way the ground went small and the horizon went wide, and the machine under your hands said clearly and without metaphor that you were exactly where you were. She pressed call. He answered on the second ring. It was after 9 in Ohio, and he had clearly been awake because Pete Callahan had never needed much sleep and had always been at his most useful in the hours when most people were not. Well, he said, and she could hear in that single word that he had seen the news, that he knew that he had been waiting. There she is. I'm coming home in a couple of days, she said, and I want to take that plane up. A pause. Short. The pause of a man who understood that the right response to this was not sentiment, but practicality. I'll file a weather check for Thursday morning, he said. Wind's supposed to be favorable. Thursday, she said. Thursday. She hung up. She went to sleep. Thursday came the way October mornings come in Ohio, with a quality of light that was neither summer's excess nor winter's austerity, but something more honest than either. Clear, deliberate. The kind of morning that neither promised nor threatened, just offered what it had. Pete Callahan was already at the airfield when she pulled up. He was standing beside the Cessna 172 with his coffee and his measured expression and the demeanor of a man who had decided some time ago that each morning was worth being present for. He handed her the weather printout without ceremony. She looked at it. Wind from the southwest at 6 knots. Visibility unlimited. No ceiling. She handed it back. She did the pre-flight herself because she always did the pre-flight herself, because that was not a step you delegated, because the pre-flight was the first conversation between a pilot and an aircraft, the one where you establish the basic facts of the relationship. The Cessna had what it needed. She got in. The cockpit of a Cessna 172 is not the cockpit of an F-15. It is something smaller and more personal, the way a conversation between two people is smaller and more personal than an address to a crowd, and no less consequential for it. She settled into the seat and put her hands on the controls and felt the aircraft tell her in the simple and direct language of all aircraft that it was ready. She was ready. She ran the checklist. She started the engine. She listened to it catch and settle into its rhythm, smaller than what she was accustomed to, but honest, the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do without apology or complication. She taxied to the end of the runway. She looked down the length of it, a small runway in a small Ohio airfield on a Thursday morning in October, the grass on either side still carrying the dew, the sky above it open and blue and offering everything it had. She thought about the count, the way she always thought about the count before every flight, one for herself, the most important count of all, because it was the one that told you what you were responsible for bringing back. She brought the throttle forward. The Cessna rolled. Slowly at first, then with gathering purpose. The wheels talking to the runway in the particular language of takeoff, the conversation that ends when the aircraft decides it has enough and lifts itself away from the ground with the quiet authority of something that was always going to do this. The wheels left the runway. The ground fell away. Ohio opened up below her in the particular way that places from the ground reveal themselves from the air, smaller and more legible and more beautiful than you expected. The familiar made new by altitude. She climbed through 1,000 feet and then 2,000, and then she leveled at 5,000 and let the Cessna find its trim and looked out at the horizon in every direction. It was very wide. It was very clear. She reached into her chest pocket and touched the photograph through the fabric, not taking it out, just confirming it was there, the way you confirm things that matter by the specific fact of their weight. It was there. Pete Callahan's voice came over the radio, mild, unhurried. How's she handling? Sarah looked at the instruments. She looked at the scone. She felt the aircraft under her hands and the air around it, and the 5,000 feet of clean Ohio morning between her and the ground. In her pocket, a photograph of two people who had made it out. In her other pocket, a pair of wings with a scratch on the lower left pinion that she had never had repaired. The numbers matched. They always had when she was flying. That was what he had wanted her to know. Not a consolation, a fact. The truest one he knew. Like she always did, she said. She kept flying. Below her, the world was doing what worlds do, moving forward, carrying everything inside its present. None of it resolved, none of it finished, all of it ongoing. 320 people were living their Thursday, each of them carrying inside them some version of the last thing they had expected to survive, which they had survived. A young first officer was sitting in a hospital room reading a letter written by a brother who had known him better than anyone. A flight attendant in Phoenix was opening an acceptance letter from a flight academy. A retired colonel was on an airplane back to Washington, carrying in his chest pocket the knowledge that the pilot he had always believed in had proven him right one final time. Or perhaps not the final time. Perhaps not final at all. And Sarah Caldwell Ghost Hawk, the woman who had walked through Honolulu Airport that morning with a straw hat and an intention to be nobody, was at 5,000 feet above Ohio, with her hands on the controls and the horizon going wide in every direction. She had never stopped being a pilot. She had just needed to remember that the sky had never stopped being hers. The Cessna banked gently west following the light. She let it.